My name is Ryan Carter, and I'm 32 years old. I've always been the kind of man who works quietly, lets results speak louder than words, and believes that loyalty, especially to family, is non-negotiable. For most of my life, I thought those values were shared by the people closest to me. I was wrong. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe to follow more stories of betrayal, redemption, and justice served. That afternoon, I was driving back from a week-long business trip in Dallas. The job had been exhausting. Early mornings, late nights, endless client dinners, but I'd landed a deal that would set my company up for months. All I wanted was to get home, drop my bag by the door, and collapse into my own bed. But when I turned into the long gravel driveway of my father's property, the place I'd called home since I was 18, I froze. At the gate, just inside the rusted iron bars, were black garbage bags. Not one or two, but at least a dozen of them. They were lined up like someone had planned their placement, each one bulging with clothes, books, and the unmistakable shape of my old guitar case. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of mix-up. Maybe my brothers were cleaning out one of the sheds, or Dad had decided to get rid of old junk. But then I saw him, my father, standing there with his arms crossed, flanked by my two brothers, Eric and Matt. They weren't smiling. I rolled down the truck window. "What's going on?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad took a step forward. "You're 25, he said, though he knew I was older now. "Get out, now." It hit me like a gut punch. No explanation, no discussion, just the sentence, sharp and final. I glanced at Eric. His jaw was set, eyes cold. Matt avoided my gaze entirely. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You heard me," Dad said, his tone the same one he'd used when I was a kid in trouble. "You're not welcome here anymore." I looked at the bags again, my life stuffed into plastic like trash. And that's when I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. I smiled. Not a forced smile, not bitter. The kind of smile you give when you realize a door has just closed and you're not going to waste your time pounding on it. I put the truck in reverse, backed down the driveway, and drove away without another word. The whole ride to the motel on the edge of town, I kept replaying the scene, the bags, the look in Dad's eyes, the silent agreement between my brothers. If they thought they'd humiliated me, they were wrong. All they'd done was give me the clean break I didn't know I needed. That night, I sat on the edge of a creaky motel bed, the neon light from the sign outside flickering through the blinds. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing. Life had just handed me a new starting line. And when I crossed the finish line this time, they were going to see it. What I didn't know then was that in 6 months, my father would be the one chasing me for answers, 60 messages deep, asking a question I had no intention of answering. People assume family betrayals happen overnight, in a single heated argument or one bad decision. But the truth is, they build over years, layer upon layer of small cuts you don't notice until you're bleeding out. Growing up, my father, David Carter, believed in two things: hard work and loyalty to the family name. He raised us on a farm that had been in the Carter line for generations. Every day started before sunrise, feeding livestock, fixing fences, stacking hay, and ended only when every task was done. I didn't resent it. In fact, I respected the discipline. But Dad was a man who kept score. Every favor came with a ledger entry, every mistake with a permanent mark against you. My brothers learned early how to play his game. Agree with him, never challenge him, and keep their ambitions small so they didn't outshine him. I wasn't wired that way. By my late 20s, I'd built a small logistics consulting firm from scratch. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and more importantly, it was mine. I worked long hours, saved aggressively, and invested in opportunities that most people in our small town didn't understand. That independence didn't sit well with Dad. The more successful I became, the more he started dropping comments in front of my brothers about how I thought I was too good for the family, or that real men work with their hands, not behind the desk. I brushed it off at first, but those words started to wedge between us. The last Christmas before everything fell apart, I noticed how Eric and Matt began echoing him. Little digs about city money and fancy clients. At family dinners, conversations turned into subtle interrogations. How much I was earning, who I was meeting with, where my contracts were coming from. Then came the offer. Dad called me into his study one night and said he wanted me to fold my business into his farm operations, handling all the transport and distribution under his name. He'd let me take a percentage of profits, but he'd own the contracts. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a takeover. I told him no. Politely, but firmly. That was the first time I saw the look, the one he gave me at the gate months later. Cold. Final. Like a man crossing my name off a list. After that, the tension became constant. Invitations to family events started arriving late or not at all. I'd come home to find my tools missing from the shed or my mail opened. My brothers suddenly had keys to my apartment above the barn and would check in while I was away. Still, I didn't think they'd actually push me out. That's the thing about betrayal. You never think it'll happen to you until it does. The night before my Dallas trip, Dad barely looked at me when I told him I'd be gone for a week. Eric smirked, Matt stayed quiet. I didn't realize it then, but they'd already decided that by the time I came back, my place here would be gone. And they kept their word. As I sat in that motel room after being thrown out, I thought about every moment over the last year, every warning sign, every time I'd chosen to ignore my gut because they were family. That was the last time I'd make that mistake. What they didn't know was that I'd been building something far bigger than my business, something they had no idea I had access to. And when the time came, it wouldn't be me knocking on their door. It would be them standing outside mine. The first few days after I left weren't about revenge. They were about survival. I checked into the cheapest extended stay motel I could find, paid for a week up front, and stored my garbage bag belongings in a rented storage unit. It wasn't glamorous. The place smelled faintly of mildew. The bed creaked every time I moved, and the coffee in the lobby tasted like burnt cardboard. But it was quiet, and quiet meant I could think. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not my business contacts, not the few friends I trusted. I knew how small towns worked. News traveled fast, and I wasn't about to hand my family the satisfaction of knowing I was struggling. If they wanted to believe I'd driven away in defeat, fine. I could work with that. Instead of licking my wounds, I started making calls. My consulting work didn't require an office, just a laptop, a phone, and clients who trusted me. And over the past few years, I'd built relationships with companies that valued discretion. They didn't care if I worked from a high-rise in Dallas or a rundown motel off Highway 14, as long as I delivered. By the end of that first week, I had 3 new contracts lined up. Enough to pay my bills, upgrade to a better place, and keep my savings intact. But I wasn't in a rush to leave the motel. There was a kind of freedom in being invisible. It gave me time to plan. One night, I sat at the small desk in my room, the hum of the neon sign outside filling the silence, and I pulled out an old leather notebook. This was something I'd kept for years, a running list of contacts, ideas, and opportunities I'd never had time to pursue. Some were just names and numbers. Others were fully mapped out strategies I'd shelved because life on the farm kept dragging me back. Now, I had nothing holding me there. I started making a new list, not of revenge exactly, but of leverage. People my father had crossed over the years, deals my brothers had bungled, local business owners who'd quietly mentioned they'd work with me if I ever went independent for real. And then there was the biggest card I had yet to play, a property deal I'd been working on for months. It was in the final stages of negotiation when I left for Dallas, a large warehouse space on the outskirts of town with direct access to the interstate. My plan had been to use it for expanding my logistics operations. Now, I saw another use for it. Owning that warehouse would put me in control of something my father's farm business depended on, affordable storage and distribution for his largest supplier. If I secured it, I wouldn't have to confront him or say a single word. The numbers would do the talking. As the days turned into weeks, I kept my head down. To anyone watching, it looked like I'd disappeared. In reality, I was setting pieces on the board, quietly, deliberately. I knew it would take months for the trap to close, and when it did, my father would have no choice but to call me. And that's exactly what happened. Though when that day came, it wasn't just a phone call. It was 60 desperate messages in a row. But that's getting ahead of the story. Closing the warehouse deal wasn't as simple as signing a contract. The property had been on the market for over a year, but my father's farm operation had been circling it quietly. He knew its location made it perfect for storing and distributing produce from his biggest supplier. If he got it, it would cut his costs in half. If someone else got it, well, that was his problem. I didn't approach it like a direct challenge. Instead, I contacted the owner through a mutual acquaintance, a retired trucking manager who'd once worked with me on a difficult delivery project. We met in a small diner 2 towns over, far enough from home that no one would see us together. The owner, a man named Frank Delaney, was tired. Tired of taxes, tired of upkeep, tired of empty promises from local buyers who wanted the place for pennies. I offered him something different, a clean, fast sale at a fair price. No haggling, no drawn-out negotiations. But there was a condition. I wanted absolute discretion. No one, especially not my father, could know I was the buyer until the ink was dry. Frank agreed without hesitation. 3 weeks later, I held the keys. The warehouse was bigger than I remembered, with high ceilings, wide loading docks, and enough floor space to handle operations far beyond my original business. Standing in the echoing emptiness, I could see every move I was about to make. I started small, offering competitive storage rates to 2 regional suppliers who had been struggling to keep costs down. Word traveled fast. Within a month, I'd signed 4 more contracts. By month 2, I had half the warehouse full and trucks coming in and out daily. None of my clients knew or cared that their shipments were now bypassing my father's operation entirely. They just knew my rates were better and my timelines tighter. Still, I didn't push too hard. The last thing I wanted was for my father to connect the dots too soon. Instead, I let the shift happen gradually. A few pallets here, a truckload there, small bites, nothing dramatic. But I also kept my eyes open. I knew my father well enough to anticipate how he'd react when the missing revenue started showing up on his ledgers. He'd look for someone to blame. My brothers would scramble, pointing fingers in every direction, and eventually, his attention would turn toward the one person he'd written off completely, me. By month 3, the calls started. Not from him directly, but from people in town. Former farmhands asking if I was hiring, a local supplier hinting that things at the Carter place aren't as steady as they used to be. I played dumb. Every time someone brought up my family, I changed the subject. Every time I drove past the farm, I kept my gaze straight ahead. Silence was my strategy, and it was working. What I didn't realize at the time was that my father wasn't just losing business, he was losing control. And for a man like him, that was worse than losing money. 6 months after I'd driven away from those garbage bags, he broke. That morning, my phone lit up with 60 messages from him, one after another, All variations of the same question. Where are you? We need to talk. I didn't reply. Not then. Not yet. Because I wasn't done.
The first message came at 6:12 a.m. Ryan, we need to talk. By 6:20, there were 5 more. Short, clipped phrases, no apologies, no explanations, just urgency. By the time I finished my coffee, my phone was buzzing nonstop. 60 messages in total. Some from my father, some from my brothers, and even a few from numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer any of them. For years, he'd spoken to me like I was an employee, not a son. He'd made decisions for me, about me, without ever asking what I wanted. But now, the balance had shifted. He wasn't in control anymore. I was, and I wasn't about to hand that power back by replying too soon. Instead, I spent the morning doing exactly what I'd planned, running my business as if nothing had happened. I met with a supplier, reviewed a new contract, and oversaw a shipment heading to Dallas. Every task I completed was a quiet reminder that I didn't need him or the farm to survive. Around noon, I drove past the old property. I wasn't trying to spy. The warehouse route just happened to take me near the farm. Still, I slowed down enough to see the changes. The driveway where I'd once parked my truck was empty. The big storage barn doors were open, revealing space that used to be packed with pallets. Now, it looked half empty. And there, near the gate where my life had once been dumped into garbage bags, stood Eric. He was on the phone, pacing, his expression tight. I didn't stop, didn't wave, just kept driving. That night, another message came in, different from the others. This time it was from my mother. She'd stayed quiet through the entire fallout, letting Dad and my brothers call the shots. But now she wrote, "Please come to Sunday dinner. Your father wants to explain." Explain. The word sat in my mind for hours. I thought about the last time we'd all sat at that table, the way my father had laid out his offer like it was a gift instead of a takeover, the way my brothers had smirked behind their drinks. If I went, they'd expect me to be defensive, angry, maybe even desperate to prove my worth. But I wasn't any of those things anymore. If I went, I'd be walking in as a man who didn't need their approval, and that was something they'd never seen from me before. I decided I would go, but not to reconcile, not to smooth things over. I'd go to let them see exactly what they'd thrown away, and how much stronger I'd become without them.
Sunday came with a cold drizzle, the kind that coated everything in a thin layer of gray. I pulled up to the farm in my truck, not the old dented one I'd driven when I lived here, but the newer model I'd bought in cash 3 months ago. I parked deliberately where they could see it from the dining room window. When I stepped out, I didn't rush. I took my time walking up the familiar path, the gravel crunching under my boots. The house looked the same, but something about it felt smaller now, like it had shrunk in my absence. My mother opened the door. She gave me a careful smile, the kind that carried more politeness than warmth. "Ryan," she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. Inside, the air smelled like roast beef and bread, Sunday dinner staples since I was a kid. My brothers were already at the table. Eric leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Matt tapped his fork against his plate, avoiding my eyes. And then there was my father. He sat at the head of the table, posture stiff, jaw tight. He didn't get up, didn't shake my hand, just gestured to the empty seat across from him. I sat down, meeting his stare without blinking. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint clink of silverware as my mother served the food. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "We've had some changes here," he began. "Some of our suppliers have moved their business elsewhere. I thought you might know something about that." I kept my expression neutral. "I run my own business, Dad. Clients come and go. That's how it works." Eric shifted in his chair.
Funny how they go to you. I smiled faintly. Maybe they like my rates. My father's eyes narrowed. This isn't a game, Ryan. No, I agreed. It's business. And in business, you treat people right or they find someone who will. Silence stretched across the table. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she poured gravy. Matt kept his gaze on his plate. Eric looked like he wanted to speak, but thought better of it. For the rest of the meal, conversation was minimal. My father asked a few probing questions about my work, but I gave short, polite answers. I didn't brag. I didn't explain. The less I said, the more their curiosity grew. When dinner ended, I stood, thanked my mother, and put on my coat. My father followed me to the door. If things keep going the way they're going, this place won't last another season. I looked him in the eye. Then maybe it's time to change the way things are done. I left, without waiting for a response. That night, as I sat in my own office reviewing contracts, I realized something. The balance of power had shifted for good, and my father knew it. It was 3 days after that Sunday dinner when the offer came. I was in my office, going over shipping schedules, when my phone buzzed with an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Proposal regarding Carter Farm operations." I opened it, half expecting some passive-aggressive message from Eric or Matt. Instead, it was from a man named Howard Griggs, a local agribusiness investor I'd met once at a Chamber of Commerce event years ago. He got straight to the point. He'd been watching the shifts in the local supply chain. He knew about the warehouse. He knew I had contracts that had once been tied to my father's farm. And now, he wanted to partner with me to buy into additional facilities, ones that could effectively take over the distribution footprint my father had built over decades. All legally, all above board, just business. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it sink in. With Griggs's capital and my existing network, we could do in 1 year what it had taken my father 20 to build. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, my father had accused me of not understanding real work, of relying on luck and easy deals. Now, his entire operation was vulnerable to the kind of strategy he'd dismissed my whole life. I didn't say yes immediately. Instead, I took the proposal and sat on it for 2 days. I wasn't just thinking about logistics or profits. I was thinking about the message it would send. On the 3rd day, I drove out to the edge of town to meet Griggs at a small cafe. He was already seated, sipping black coffee, a file folder on the table in front of him. "Glad you came," he said, shaking my hand. This could be the start of something big for both of us. We talked numbers, timelines, and potential sites. Every detail made sense. Every projection was solid. But what sealed it for me wasn't the money. It was the fact that none of this required me to take a single step onto Carter Farm soil. I could do it all from the outside, and they'd have no choice but to watch it happen. By the time I left that meeting, I'd agreed in principle. We'd move forward quietly, keeping my name out of early paperwork until the deals were too far along to stop. Driving back, I thought about the look on my father's face at Sunday dinner, the unspoken admission in his eyes. This new move would take that crack in his confidence and split it wide open. And still, I wasn't doing it out of spite, not entirely. I was doing it to prove, once and for all, that the life they'd thrown into garbage bags at the gate was worth far more than they ever realized. The reckoning was coming, and I wouldn't have to raise my voice for them to hear it. 6 months after I signed the partnership with Griggs, the changes in town were impossible to ignore. The old Carter Farm trucks, once a constant presence on the roads, were fewer and older looking. I heard from a supplier that my father had sold off 2 of his delivery vehicles to cover debts. Another mentioned he'd laid off half his seasonal workers. Meanwhile, the new facilities we'd acquired were running at full capacity. Every week, another former Carter Farm client shifted their business to us. It wasn't personal to them, it was simply better service, better rates, better treatment. But for my father, it was personal. The first time I saw him after the expansion was at the feed store. He walked in, looking smaller somehow, his shoulders a little more hunched. Our eyes met, and for a second I thought he might come over. Instead, he just nodded once, no words, and walked past me. 2 weeks later, I got another message from my mother. Just 4 words this time. Your father wants peace. Peace? It would have been easy to read that as a victory, but standing in my office, looking out at the fleet of trucks we'd built from the ground up, I realized I didn't need his admission, his handshake, or his apology. I'd already won. Not because I'd taken his business apart piece by piece, but because I'd built something stronger without him. That weekend, I drove out toward the farm. Not to visit, not to talk, just to see it one last time from the road. The gate was closed, the yard quiet. And I remembered the day I'd found my life in garbage bags, right there. Back then, they thought they were closing a chapter for me. They didn't know they were starting the best one yet. I turned the truck around, the gravel crunching under the tires, and headed back toward the life I'd built, a life they could no longer touch. Because sometimes the loudest revenge is the life you live in silence.